Next up on the Anti-Racism Summer Series, prompted by national conversations on racial injustice, Dr. Dana Dillon leads a session titled Anti-Racism as a Necessary Christian Virtue, discussing virtue ethics and Catholic social tradition. Dr. Dillon is a professor in PC's departments of Theology and Public and Community Service Studies, and is also Associate Director of the Development of Western Civilization program. The workshop was moderated by Bob Pfunder of the class of 2009, who was Associate Vice President of Mission and Ministry.
Okay, well, why don't we begin? Good afternoon, everybody. It's an honor and a pleasure to have you here. By way of introduction, my name is Bob Pfunder. I am the Associate Vice President for Mission and Ministry here at Providence College. Myself and I'm an alum of class of 2009. And I am excited to welcome you to the second session of the Office of Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion's Anti-Racism Summer Virtual Series. And I'll be your moderator today, and I'll say a few words about kind of structure and the ways in which engagement will happen over Zoom in a few minutes. But I'd like to introduce our speaker today, Dr. Dana Dillon. Dr. Dillon is Associate Professor of Theology and Public and Community Service Studies, and she's also the Associate Director of the Development of Western Civilization program. So she's very busy. She wears a few different hats. But true to Dr. Dillon's three-part job title, today she'll be reflecting on the intersection of anti-racism work and conceptualizations with the Christian tradition, so the work of Jesus Christ, and the virtue ethics tradition, which you may, I hope, perhaps remember from your Civ days, at least for those of you who are a part of Civ. The title of her presentation is Anti-Racism as a Necessary Christian Virtue. By way of moderating duties, I would like to just say one thing, as I alluded to. Dr. Dillon will present for about a half hour, kind of until about 1:30 or so. And as you're listening to her presentation and reflecting and engaging, if you have any questions you'd like to ask for a Q&A session after, we'd encourage you to use the Q&A button. If you look at the bottom of Zoom, there's a Q&A button. Click there and you can submit your questions there. The chat function is a little different. That's for something that goes out to all participants in this Zoom webinar, but the Q&A will actually queue your question up to be considered for Dr. Dillon. And we'll move into that Q&A section after her talk. But if you have any questions in the interim, just feel free to send them via the Q&A section. That could be either technological questions or questions about Dr. Dillon's presentation. And we'll go from there. And so without further ado, let's welcome Dr. Dillon to the virtual podium.
Here we go. Thanks everybody for coming. And I'm really, this is an important topic and I'm really pleased to be asked to share some thoughts with you. I'm gonna actually pull up a PowerPoint here. So give me a minute to share my screen. And get this going. All right, so and I'm just going to dive right into an overview here. I'm going to do these things. I'm going to try. You'll notice sometimes with the slides, I'm not going to read everything on there. I'm going to talk through things that are related to what's on there, and hopefully you can handle the multitasking. I'm sure you can. And really, by way of starting, I wanted to just comment that. Although anti-racism work is really important work for everybody to do, whether they're Christian or not, today I'm going to sort of unapologetically talk as a Christian theologian to fellow Christians. I hope there are some non-Christians also listening, but I hope you don't mind that I'm going to talk in terms of Christians and what's demanded of us by the gospel in terms of our own commitment to anti-racism work. And you can see I'm going to go through a little things personal and some comments from the tradition, and then hopefully we'll get back to some specifics here as well. So I wanted to start though by talking a little bit about the importance of self-criticism and also what we sometimes call fraternal correction, that idea of brothers and sisters inviting one another to do better. And again, you can see this quote from Matthew there. I'm not going to read it to you, but the gist of it here is that we really need to pay attention to the beam in our own eye before we pick out the splinter in our brothers and sisters' eyes. And so I want to really invite us to be as harshly self-critical as we can, and as gently other critical as we can be, as we invite other people to deeper reflection on their own implicit racism, implicit bias, white privilege, other terms like that. So I invite you to consider it in that spirit. And I want to talk a little bit, as I said, about my own personal journey. I did my undergraduate work at the University of Notre Dame. I was a theology major and with a peace studies concentration. I practically had a minor in Catholic social thought. I was definitely very interested in social justice issues. And I'll just date myself, class of 1993. So that's when I was there. And I think that it's fair to say that I never thought seriously in my undergraduate days about racial injustice, despite a lot of thinking about Catholic social thought and justice, social justice more broadly. I never really thought about it. I certainly was not asked to read a encyclical on racial justice until much later. And I say that both to name some personal failing there, and also institutional failing in terms of the Catholic Church and its attention to racism. I think those things go together. But I also want to tell you a story. The year after I graduated from Notre Dame, I was working in a parish, and I went to visit a friend of mine. I was in the Seattle, Washington area, and my friend was in the Bellingham, Washington area. I drove up to Bellingham to have dinner and spend some time with this friend. And partway through our visit, we were deciding to go for a cup of coffee across the border in Canada. Neither of us had been to Canada yet. We were newly relocated to Washington State. And in a moment, an impulsive moment, I decided to say a phrase that had been all over my childhood. I said, well, you know what? We're both free, white, and 21. Let's go. Well, my friend, Mike, was half Hawaiian and half Chinese. And so in that moment, after I said that, I had this horror. And here, I want to tell you, here's what went through my mind. It all happened very quickly. I thought, wait a minute. Am I allowed to say that to him? Because how does he count in this black-white racial world that I hadn't really thought about, but thought I knew? Well, then the full impact of what I was saying by using the phrase free, white, and 21, implying that other people were not free if they were not white. And of course, I was about 22, so it was new to me to be able to use this phrase positively about myself. However, I was horrified by what I had said. And for me, it was a beginning of an awareness that I, like so many of us, growing up in the culture that we've grown up in, we learn scripts, right? Ways of speaking in the world, ways of acting in the world, ways of seeing the world that are much more racialized than we've ever thought about. Again, I had not thought about the racialism of that phrase. So it was a moment where I came to a greater awareness of some of my own unconscious bias. And I think that I can say that for the almost 30 years since that moment, I have very consistently been awakened in new ways to something else that I didn't realize was as racialized, day after day, month after month. And one of the things I want to say is, as you'll see as I go through this material, the invitation that I want to offer to each and every one of us today is that we need to get better every single day about being less racist and more anti-racist in everything that we do. And with that, I want to move us into a little bit more of what the Catholic Church has said about racial justice. So one of the things on this, this book came out almost 10 years ago now, Brian Massengales, Racial Justice and the Catholic Church. It's a really important reading if you're interested in this. Father Massengale is a Catholic priest, and he teaches now at Fordham. He taught for quite a while at Marquette, but now he's at Fordham. I believe he's a priest of the Diocese of Milwaukee. And he covers what I'm going to cover and so much more. But just as a quick overview here. So the U.S. Catholic bishops have now 4 times gotten together and as a conference explicitly written on race and racism. You see the years there. In 1958 and 1968, those statements were actually demanded by the Vatican. Again, Father Massengale does this history quite powerfully. The Vatican could not believe that the U.S. Catholic bishops were not commenting on racism in the moment that was 1958. Right? And think about what had gone on in the 1950s in terms of the beginnings of the civil rights movement, about Brown versus Board of Education and so many of these other things. But until November of 2018, they had not commented on this. It was almost 40 years. Now, there are clear condemnations of racism in all of these documents. And in fact, they get progressively clearer on the complex nature of both personal sin, right, and structural sin that is involved. And they really call Catholics to do better on all these things. And as a general rule, when I poll my students on whether they've heard of these documents, most of them have not. I'm a little tempted to poll you on it, but I'm not going to. I want to give you a few of the highlights of what they say in these documents. And brothers and sisters to us from 1979, they make it pretty clear that they call racism an evil. They call it an enduring evil, one that continues both in society and in the church. But one of the things that they emphasize here, and the bold here is from me, not from them, is that despite all the changes that had happened in the 2 decades prior to 1979, they name that it's largely only external appearances that have seemed to have changed. They also emphasize in this document this idea that I think we're now more and more realizing, that racism is part of the very fabric of America. Whether you're talking about the genocide of the Native Americans, the anti-immigrant sentiment in so many other places, and of course the history of slavery, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration, we have this continuing legacy. Racism is part of our very structures. They also emphasize that racism is not one sin among many. It's a radical evil. It divides our human family. It denies, think about this, it denies the new creation of a redeemed world. In other words, it's denying the work that Christ did on our behalf. And they invite us, again, this proclamation. We've got to proclaim to all that the sin of racism defiles the image of God in each and every one of us, both the one who perpetrates racism and the one that it's perpetrated against. And so there's a real invitation here to overcome this terrible sin and become more united. Now, I wanted to take a moment though and discuss this idea. If we're calling racism a sin, well, how do we think about sin? What makes something sinful? And this goes back to a long tradition, right? And this is, in many ways, this is the analysis that Thomas Aquinas offers, that he's following Aristotle. This is, I think, the part that Bob hopes you remember some of it from Civ. I do too. But the traditional sources of morality in an act are the intention, the circumstances, and the object of the act. Some people talk about, one way to talk about the object of the act is, if you could strip out the intention and the circumstances, then what is left is the sort of objective nature of the act, and that's what we mean by the object. But those 3 components in looking at the three of them together is how we can then judge an act as morally good or morally bad. And of course, if it's morally bad, we Christians have a word for it, and it's sin. And of course, when we sin, we need to identify that, confess it, repent of it, make reparations if we can. It's a loaded word in a conversation about race, but and to commit not to engage in the sin again. Sinful acts are most properly understood as sinful acts when they've been when the actor, the subject of the act, is engaging both their intellect and their will, right? So in other words, I know what I'm doing and I'm freely choosing to do that. Just as a sort of easy example, something like murder is clearly wrong. So if I see you there, if I know that the gun that I'm using, I'm aiming it at you, I'm intending to aim it at you, then I clearly, like, that's murder. It's a wrong act. If the intellect is compromised in some way, imagine that we're hunting together and I actually didn't see you there. I didn't see you and know you were there and intend to shoot you. It's still a terrible, terrible thing that my act has resulted in your death. But morally, it is, because I didn't know that that's what I was doing, we wouldn't see it as an intentional act, as a sinful act in the same way. Now, to stay with that example just a little bit longer, we can also talk about what the reasonable precautions that I should have taken, right? Shouldn't we both have been, I'm not a hunter, but shouldn't we both have been wearing those like bright orange vests? Shouldn't I not have shot at the first noise that I heard? Shouldn't I kind of have been aware of where my hunting partner was before I took that shot? Isn't there a certain responsibility that I have to make sure that I know what I'm doing before I fire that gun? Again, that's about the engagement of the intellect, and then also then freely choosing it as well. Stanley Hauerwas, theologian at Duke, he was actually my dissertation advisor. You might know Laura or Adam Hauerwas. Adam is his son, so part of the PC community by family connection here. But Stanley has famously said, you can only act in a world that you can see, and you can only learn to see by learning to say. And I think it's important to spend some time on this a little bit, because one of the key things with racism that complicates it, makes it more complicated than something like murder, is we are often formed. We're told a story where America is about equal opportunity and all people are created equal and everybody has the same rights and freedoms. And in many ways, we're shaped by our culture not to see race and not to blame race for things. So I just want to hold on to this complicated nature of the importance of learning to see the truth of the matter in terms of our racial relations, because I do believe that we have a moral responsibility to do that. A little bit more about virtue ethics in this case, because again, my central claim here is that anti-racism is a necessary virtue for Christians. So again, we're following a tradition around virtue ethics here. And one of the basic premises in virtue ethics is that like acts create like habits. So the more we say the honest word, and instead of taking the easy way out with a lie, we create that habit of that commitment to honesty, right? And the opposite is also true. The more we tell the lie, the like acts create like habits. It works for vice as well as for virtue. So virtues are often defined as stable dispositions that help the will and the intellect seek the good and the true. Right? And by the way, let me remind you, right, that God is the highest good, and also the way, the truth, and the life. Jesus says that he himself is the way, the truth, and the life. So that idea that virtues are these dispositions that help draw us by our intellect and our will. Sometimes people say by knowledge and by love to the good and the true. That's also about drawing us in more deeply to the life, to the life with God that we are called to. You see the cardinal virtues there, and the theological virtues, and of course those are important and crucial virtues. And I think a lot of people would make an argument that would say something like, if we do all of these and we do them well, we don't need an additional virtue like anti-racism. But part of what I'm trying to suggest to you here is that without actively cultivating that virtue of anti-racism, we are going to fail to love in the way that we are called to love. I'm gonna bring in the big guns here. St. John Paul II actually talked about a moral virtue that he thought we needed. This is in his Solicitudo Rei Socialis, which was a 1987 encyclical of his. He says that because we're intrinsically connected to one another, there is a bond of interdependence between individuals and peoples, which is found at every level. So he says that there just is that bond. It's already there among us. But he also says that solidarity is a moral virtue, which we need to work on and grow in it, because it helps us to know the depth of that bond and to act accordingly. And I am gonna read this quote. It's important, it's crucial. He says that solidarity is not a feeling of vague compassion or shallow distress at the misfortunes of so many people, both near and far. On the contrary, it is a firm and persevering determination to commit oneself to the common good. That is to say, the good of all and of each individual, because we are all really responsible for all. And I want to just add on that again, I think that we can embrace solidarity very much sort of in theory and say, well, so solidarity is enough. Why do we have to cultivate a particular virtue of anti-racism? And the answer to that is just the complex reality of our history. And you're going to see my slides now transition. They're more artwork for a little while now. But this is a 1916 piece, originally published in Crisis, which that was the journal of the NAACP. W.E.B. Du Bois was, I believe, the managing editor of it at that point that this was published. But what you see here, and I mean, again, this is what I want to invite us to be haunted by. This is, of course, a lynching. And if you looked at the crowd, in addition to killing this man by hanging him from a tree, you can see that there's wood stacked to kill him again. People are to burn the body. People are throwing rocks. People are shooting guns. And if this is an average crowd in 1916, it was probably a lot of Christians. And I think one of the things that we need to be deeply haunted by is how was it that in the history of Christianity and the history of the West and the history of colonization and colonialism, right? How is it that Christians were unable to stop one another from behavior like this? And this just zooms in a little bit here so that you see the quote from Matthew 25, and you can see better that connection. How is it that people who follow a Savior who was himself put to death by a mob in many ways, how is it that we couldn't see this connection for so much of our history? That we couldn't see that we were called to something better. And I want to just take, so I want to read to you a quote. I did not actually put this one on one of the slides, but the Bishop of Natchitoches, Louisiana in 1861, his name was August Martin. And he wrote a pastoral letter to his diocese, encouraging them to do the good work of supporting the Confederacy in defending slavery. And I want to read this to you because, and the key thing that I want you to hear here is that this is the way our bishops have sometimes led us. And so it's really challenging to think through how we ought to have discerned better morally when this was the leadership we were getting. Bishop Martin said, "The manifest will of God is that in exchange for a freedom which they are unable to defend and which will kill them, and in return for a lifetime of work, we must give these unfortunate people not only the bread and clothes necessary to the material life, but also their just share of truth and the goods of grace, which may console their present troubles with the hope of eternal rest." He goes on to say, "Slavery, far from being an evil, is an eminently Christian work. The redemption of millions of human beings who would pass in such a way from the darkest intellectual night to the sweet light of the gospel." This is a picture of what we were doing in the work of colonialism, slavery, etc., that argues that taking people out of their homes in Africa and enslaving them to work for us was a gift to them. The depth of the bias about what that means about Black persons and African cultures is terrifying. And yet that continues, that ingrained mindset, which has lasted in our country and in our churches longer, for more than half of the history of this nation, right, is not easily fought, but it's crucial that we do so. And I will just, the slide that I've left up here for a little while is, I think, a painfully beautiful expression. It's inspired by Ferguson, and which is where the beginning of "Hands Up, Don't Shoot" as a protest cry came in, and you can see an image here of what it might be to see Christ as, again, the victim of violence, and of course Mary as the mother of a son who suffered violence. It really is part of a way to see our tradition. So coming from Bishop Martin, I want to come forward all the way to Bishop Mark Seitz of El Paso, Texas, who wrote a letter to his diocese in the wake of the George Floyd murder. And you can see the quote here. Oops, accidentally went on to Sister Thea. But he invites us to see that Christ comes to us crucified and powerless, and to see this connection between Christ's suffering and so many people who have suffered violence at the hands of police and of others. And he talks here about the church's preferential option for the poor. In case anybody's not familiar with it, that the church does teach that as we look at the gospel, the scriptural revelation, right, from taking the side of the Israelites and freeing them from slavery in Egypt, all the way down to Jesus's tendency to hang out with the sinners and the tax collectors and the prostitutes. God so consistently chooses the side of the poor that we too, as followers of Christ, are invited by church teaching to make a preferential option for the poor, to choose those who are marginalized, to choose those who are forgotten and oppressed. And that, again, I will say, is part of the reason that why I see that it's so important that we, in the racial reality that we live in, we have to consistently choose those who are oppressed, those who are oppressed because of race, and make sure that we are in solidarity with them. And I'm going to wrap up my remarks here for now, and with this word of hope, I think, from Sister Thea Bowman. Sister Thea Bowman addressed the U.S. Bishops' Conference in 1989. That's actually a video that you can find online. It's well worth watching. But at the end of this video, she says this: "Today we are called to walk together in a new way toward that land of promise, and to celebrate who we are and whose we are. If we as church walk together, don't let nobody separate you. That's one thing Black folk can teach you. Don't let folk divide you up. The church teaches us that the church is a family of families, and the family got to stay together. If we walk and talk and work and play and stand together in Jesus' name, we'll be who we say we are, truly Catholic. And we shall overcome the poverty, overcome the loneliness, overcome the alienation, and build together a holy city, a new Jerusalem, a city set apart, where they will know we are His because we love one another." And I will just add that invitation to the church to be a family is also an invitation to us at Providence College to be the Friar family, and to be it in a better, deeper way than we've ever done before, where all are welcome, all are included, all have a seat at the table. Thank you so much. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Dillon. And just a reminder, if you have any questions about her presentation, you can submit them in the Q&A section. We have a few already there. But why don't we jump in? So one of the first questions we received, Dana, is maybe looking for some sense of explanation of terms, definitions of terms, but also sorting through conceptually, what's the relation between acknowledging white privilege and anti-racism? How would you understand that?
So yeah, complicated questions. I would say that, I mean, again, part of the claims, and there are people such as sociologists and historians who are probably better equipped than I am to really give the depth of an answer to this particular question. But you know, it's just pretty clear that so much of our nation, our legal institutions, our economic institutions, certainly our prison institutions and policing institutions and those kinds of things, were set up in such a way that it was easier for white people to keep, maintain, and expand property, and all other kinds of, like, debt, mortgage, redlining for mortgages and real estate, and these kinds of things. There are so many ways that the deck has been stacked against you if you're a person of color, and for you if you're a white person. And so part of this idea of acknowledging white privilege is to begin to acknowledge that we have benefited from that. So I mentioned Brian Massengales' book. He also had a recent piece, which I think it's already connected to the anti-racism resources on the site related to this talk and its recording. But he talks about the assumptions of white privilege in there. And one of the things that he points to is this recent incident with Amy Cooper. If you know this is this woman who in Central Park, an African-American man who was bird watching, got her on video. And part of what she does, as he is asking her to abide by the law and put her dog on a leash, she ends up recording him, he's recording her, and she threatens him with, "I'm going to call the police and tell them that an African-American man is threatening me." And so part of what Father Massengale does in this recent piece is he says, this is what white privilege looks like in a world where policing and other things are structured such that even in this moment in 2020, right, a woman like Amy Cooper can make the bet that the police are going to believe her, not the African-American man. Well, of course, cell phones begin to interrupt this, right, as they do with police violence and all these ways too. But the that's some of the assumption that goes behind white privilege. And I think, again, if we're serious about being Christians, right, believing that every person is made in the image and likeness of God, and that the least of these, right, are the ones that Christ most identifies with, and who we as a church are called to identify with, then we have to be actively doing this work of anti-racism, and that does mean dismantling white privilege. And one other, just as a quick line, a line from Brian Massengale, which he says, white Christians in America ought to make it their mantra. The only reason that racism still persists is that white people benefit from it. It's a challenging teaching. But think about that. If we really had the will, this problem could be solved. That made it sound too easy, but over years, right? We could have been doing this for working on this much better for hundreds of years.
One question we had in the chat, Dana, is, and I know you have a history of teaching high school students at one point in your life. How would you start this conversation of working with teenagers? The person asking the question teaches Catholic social thought in a Catholic high school setting.
Oh, wow. Yeah, great question. So one thing I would say is that I would do with them what I did on this presentation today, which is start with one's own inadequacies. Again, I believe so deeply that we all have a lot of things to learn and also things to unlearn, right? We need to be very critically self-conscious of our own assumptions. So there's Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the book White Fragility, was on our campus in February. And one of the things that I think it's both in the book and it's something that she said, she says that she talks to people all the time who say, I'm not a racist because I was taught to treat everybody equally. And one of the things that DiAngelo says is, well, you may have been told to treat everybody equally, but you were actually taught that people have different value, right? And what she's naming there is, as much as we do say these things, right? Everybody's created in the image and likeness of God. Everybody has an equality of dignity and such things. The need to really examine how our practices and institutions fail to live up to that, and our own, again, examination of conscience, our own attitudes and implicit biases. So I guess I'd start there.
We had someone asking then in the context of Providence College, but the need for a particular virtue of anti-racism. What are your thoughts on how this can be emphasized in our own Providence College community?
Sorry, I missed just a bit of that. I missed a word in that. Could you repeat the
Yep.
question?
We had someone ask with regard to the need to cultivate a particular virtue of anti-racism. What are your thoughts on how this can be emphasized in our own PC community?
Yeah, I have. So, I think, let me just acknowledge that I can't rattle off the numbers like I'm sure Raul Fonts or somebody could, but admissions hiring, I think PC has made a lot of progress in the last 10 or 15 years. So I want to affirm that. So couple of things. I think that we do need to be deeply intentional about our hiring so that we can hire. And I mean, Bob and I've actually had this conversation quite a bit. I think that many people on our campus sometimes ask these questions like, well, what should we prioritize more, like Catholic identity or diversity? And I just get blown away by that question, because to me, living as a more racially just community is part and parcel of what it means to live our Catholic identity well, in my opinion. So I do think part of it is about continuing with recruiting diverse classes of students, hiring, et cetera. I also do think that we should be looking to curriculum issues. I teach a DWC colloquium called Racism and Theologies of Liberation. I've co-taught that, I think, for 7 years now with Jennifer Aluzzi from the history department. And I know that, one of the interesting things that happened this past year was there were more courses on race for colloquia than there ever had been before. And so it was kind of one of these things that you love and you hate, because they competed, these other ones competed with us for some of the students that we were hoping to get, right? But what a great thing that there are more options like that. And I think that we need to really continue to develop them. Sometimes students, I actually, since the George Floyd murder and the protests and et cetera, I've actually had several former students from that class reach out to me and say, Dr. Dillon, I've been thinking about that class so much, and what do you think? Can we work to make that class a requirement for every single PC student? And I've kind of gently said to them, I don't think that's a great idea. I think that when we make those things requirements, sometimes people, oh, it's a requirement, I got to get out of the way. I think we need to have interesting, vibrant courses that engage race in every department where it's reasonable to do so, and invite people in sort of invitationally, but make it so serious and so important that students hardly could get through our curriculum without engaging those kinds of courses and those kinds of ideas.
One question that has come up is, what do you believe are the connections between racism and other forms of oppression or prejudice, and how do you see Catholic social teaching acknowledging that and addressing it?
So it's a great question. So one word that of course comes up sometimes is intersectionality, and that names that, if there is, and of course there is, a certain amount of oppression related to race and related to gender and related to sexual orientation, etc. So then if you're I also want to name anti-immigrant sentiment, right? Those kinds of things. So if you're a queer Black woman from another country with an accent, right? Like you're going to experience all those forms of oppression in a way that it's so hard to sort of pull the threads out to name which is which. I also, I mean, again, I'm thinking about what people might be getting at in the question. One thing I like to resist is, I mean, at the risk of being flippant, like the oppression Olympics. One thing that we do in the class that I mentioned is we really start with the traditions around anti-Judaism and anti-Semitism in the early church and then Europe, and then we expand to a lot more of a focus on anti-Black racism in the U.S. But one of the things that happens sometimes is you actually have, sometimes it's a student of color who said, I don't understand why we're spending all this time on this ancient history of, so what, or if Jews were oppressed way back when, we're the ones who are oppressed now. And of course, if you're paying any attention to news, it's actually not that fair to say Jews were only oppressed way back when, right? Anti-Semitism is absolutely still a real thing, real and vibrant. And by the way, again, saying good things about PC, we have a great Jewish Catholic theological exchange and a great history about working with Jews on our campus and Jewish alums, which is a really good thing. But I think sometimes people kind of try to compare these things in a way that I think actually Catholic social thought really resists well. So, and to go in a slightly different direction here, sometimes people say, well, I don't want to talk about Black Lives Matter because all lives matter. Or sometimes I have friends who are in the pro-life movement who are very much focused on anti-abortion work, which is important work, who basically say, well, yeah, Black Lives Matter, but I'm more concerned about unborn lives. And to me, when I read that quote from John Paul II about the common good. The common good is the good of all and the good of each. And one of the ways Catholic social teaching asks the question of whether all are flourishing is through the preferential option for the poor. So asking the question is, are those of us who are most at risk, are we flourishing or not? Like, that's how we get to the question. Do all lives matter? Well, one of the ways you ask is you say, well, what lives are most threatened? And so I think it's important to hang on to a consistent life ethic that says yes to Black Lives Matter and yes to all lives matter, blue lives matter, all of them. But it's also the case that in this particular moment where we're seeing video after video, right? I mean, it's astounding that you have Rayshard Brooks die so soon on the heels of George Floyd, right? Like that this still happens again and again. And so, right, that's why I think it's really crucial to say in the name of the common good and the preferential option for the poor in this moment, it's really important to hang on to Black Lives Matter if we want to hang on to all lives matter at all.
We have a question that actually segues really well with this, particularly with your remarks on anti-Semitism and anti-Judaism. And the question is, I'm struck by some of the similarities with the way Catholic theology began to confront anti-Semitism / anti-Judaism in the last century. What do you think a Catholic theological approach to anti-racism can take from this?
Oh, that's a great question. So, I think one thing to take is, that really started with listening and with dialogue. And so I think that's one of the key things, right? What are the ways, like, how can we create the space to listen well to Black voices among us? And I mean, I want to say Black voices, the Black experience, full stop, but I also want to highlight in a particular way the experience of Black Catholics. right? Because there are, I think the estimate right now is about 4 million Black Catholics in the U.S. This is a significant percentage of our population. And it's one of, sometimes when I'm having conversations with people about civ curriculums and things like that, part of what I try to suggest, like sometimes people is like, oh, why are you distracting from these other important things that we should be covering in civ by including these, you know, these diverse voices when they're not the very most important ones, or what the ones that I think are the very most important ones. And part of what I say to that is that it's crucial that we hear these voices and these experiences, because they're part and parcel of the entire experience of what it means to be Catholic in the U.S. And again, there's a significant scandal in looking at those things, and some of the things that my friend Bishop Martin said, for instance. But it's really important work. So first, listen to that experience, and the other thing I would add is listen with humility, because I'm sure I have a lot of, you know, Catholics on the line here somewhere. I don't think it's always one of the gifts of our magisterium to be great at leading with listening. And I think that the Jewish Catholic exchange, that dialogue, was a moment where they began to make an exception to that. And it would be a very interesting thing to try to emulate that better. I will also say that one of the interesting things is, although you have these documents that were written by the entire Conference of Catholic Bishops, there are also a few smaller statements that have been issued by Black Catholic bishops and Black Catholic clergy. There's also an entity known as the Black Catholic Theological Symposium. And so, I mean, part of what I think it's important to do, both institutionally and individually, is, you know, listen to those voices or read those voices, you know, through text. And I can't resist just adding, if you're not familiar with this scandal over Gloria Purvis, who's an EWTN commentator, African-American woman who's been speaking out on racism, and who has been at least one set of networks have taken her show off the air. Not EWTN, but part of their syndicated network. Like this is it's a scandal right now, going on right now. We've got to find ways to not only listen to those voices, but protect the podiums and microphones that they do have.
I think we have time for one more, and we have a few others. And let me just say, if you have any additional questions, please throw them in the Q&A. This will be posted up on the Institutional Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion website, and there will be a kind of a written portion where questions that maybe didn't get full address or we weren't able to ask, Dr. Dillon will be able to kind of write in and provide some resources as well in written form after those. So for instance, we have a few questions that are kind of diving into the concept of virtue as a habit, and virtue as the mean between two vices, the kind of the goods that particular virtue seek, and how do you parse that out? That's a pretty high level question for 4 minutes. So, and there's a couple of them that address that. So we'll move to that, to the actual answer board, but maybe a good final question as we depart, is, can you talk more on what you mean by saying God is the highest good?
Wow. Wow. You're taking me levels up there. Okay. So, yeah, this is, wow. All the questions I thought I was going to get. No, I wasn't thinking about that one. So
you'll get to answer other questions though later, so don't worry about it. Yeah, they'll get there.
This is a long tradition that so like goodness, like wow, this is good. So God is not just the biggest person in the universe. God is the ground, the ground of all being, right? God is what makes existence possible. And in the same way, God is. I called it God the highest good. That's traditional language, but God is not only the highest good, but God transcends the very concept of good so greatly that God's goodness is bigger than anything that we can conceive of. In the same way, you could say the same thing about truth. But part of what I was trying to get at is there really is this sense in Catholic moral theology that the way we're ordered, the way our souls are ordered, we have an intellect and we have a will. And St. Augustine famously said, right, O Lord, you have made us for yourself, and our hearts are restless until they rest in you. The sort of less poetic way of saying that is God has designed us such that our will is hungering for that goodness that only God can fill. And every form of desire, as we look for, a good job, a good friend, we're in a way, we're kind of hungering after that greater goodness that only God can fill. And we believe something similar about truth, that every truth that we're aiming after, and those of us, I know we have a lot of scholars and teachers on the call here as well. Those of us who seek in a scholarly life after whatever truth, sociological or accountancy or chemistry or theological, are seeking after that truth. But God is the greatest truth, the fullness of truth. Again, as Christ says, the way, the truth, and the life. And so we're ordered at will and at intellect to hunger for truth and goodness and truth, and actually to hunger for God and to seek that union with God, that fulfillment that only God can really fill. I'm tempted to find some way to bring it back to anti-racism, but I guess the kind of a last word, if we have the time for it, is to just say it's in exactly that framework of goodness and truth that demands that we seek for this fuller understanding about our social structures and our privilege and how race impacts those things, and that we work out of love to make those social structures and our attitudes and all these things the embodiment, the best embodiment of love that we can make them. And I will also say that even as we work as hard as we can to bring that about, we also need to pray for God's grace to help us in doing our part, but also to give us the justice which could only come from God.
Thank you, Dr. Dillon. It is 2:00. I think that is our official close. Nick Saylor, is there anything you'd like to add?
I guess on behalf of Institutional Diversity, thank you so much. This has been riveting. I have been fortunate enough to have Dr. Dillon as a professor of mine. And so kind of being in this other sort of perspective is really remarkable, and just really seeing, how much of her work really encapsulates the spirit and the embodiment of anti-racism. Like you said, Bob, these resources will be posted on our Institutional Diversity website. And if you all stay on the line for less than 2 seconds, I will put up the link for the next Anti-Racism Summer Series presentation by Dr. Christopher Chambers, a fantastic sociologist. So if you are hungering, like we just talked about, for more, for seeking that continual truth, please continue to sign up for this inaugural Anti-Racism Summer Series. I will put that in the chat in just a quick second, and that's it from me.
Thank you for listening to the Providence College podcast. Episodes are available in all of the usual places, as well as the college's YouTube channel and on your smart speaker. For producer Chris Judge, I'm Liz Kay. Until next time.